The impact of political correctness on comedy and the decline of Australian humor. Introduction. Comedy has long served as a powerful social tool for subverting authority, challenging norms, and reflecting society's absurdities. Its role in fostering dialogue, provoking thought, and even contributing to democratic resistance cannot be understated. However, in recent years, comedy seems to be losing its edge, especially in societies that increasingly prioritize political correctness. One of the most notable examples of this shift is seen in Australian comedy, which, once famous for its irreverence and sharp wit, now often seems shackled by the constraints of modern sensitivities. This essay explores how authoritarianism, disguised as political correctness, undermines the essence of comedy, with specific reference to Australian shows such as Full Frontal and the McAuliffe Program. Additionally, we'll delve into how this shift reflects a broader phenomenon, where the suppression of humor represents the suppression of dissent and resistance, as exemplified by the movie V for Vendetta. Ultimately, we conclude that political correctness and comedy are inherently at odds, with the former exerting a stifling influence that diminishes the value and impact of the latter. The disappearance of comedy under authoritarianism. Comedy thrives in environments that allow for free expression, irreverence, and the capacity to poke fun at power. Historically, authoritarian regimes have sought to suppress humor because of its ability to reveal uncomfortable truths and challenge the status quo. One of the first casualties of such environments is often humor itself, as laughter has the power to disarm and destabilize rigid power structures. In the pursuit of political correctness, a well-intentioned but frequently authoritarian mode of enforcing social norms, comedy is one of the first art forms to be curtailed. Political correctness, in its most extreme form, often resembles authoritarianism. It creates a set of moral and ethical guidelines that are deemed inviolable, thereby limiting the scope of permissible speech. Comedy, which depends on the freedom to ridicule and question, cannot exist freely under these conditions. The more politically correct society becomes, the less room there is for satire, parody, or even light-hearted jesting. The boundaries of what is deemed acceptable tighten, resulting in a sanitized form of humor that lacks the sharpness and bite of its predecessors. When politically correct sensibilities take precedence, comedians are forced to self-censor. They avoid topics that might offend, leading to bland, inoffensive content that neither challenges the audience nor makes them think. This environment of fear creates a landscape where the primary function of comedy, to provoke thought and challenge established norms, can no longer thrive. Comedians who once used their platform to mock the powerful or highlight societal absurdities now find themselves walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of acceptability, rather than taking risks that could get them cancelled. The decline of Australian comedy. From irreverence to compliance. Australian comedy in the 1990s, particularly through shows like Full Frontal and the McAuliffe Program, was renowned for its sharp, biting humor. These shows were fearless in their mockery of politicians, celebrities, and societal norms. Full Frontal, for instance, was a sketch comedy series that poked fun at everything from Australian politics to popular culture. It didn't shy away from controversial topics, and it wasn't afraid to punch up at those in power. Similarly, the McAuliffe Program, with its absurdist humor and clever satirical sketches, pushed the boundaries of what was considered mainstream comedy. Both shows thrived in an environment where the primary aim of comedy was to make audiences think, laugh, and reflect. However, in recent years, Australian comedy has shifted toward a more politically correct framework, leading to the creation of shows that are safe, rather than genuinely funny or subversive. This shift is a reflection of broader societal changes, where the fear of offending certain groups outweighs the desire to engage in meaningful or challenging comedic discourse. Comedians today often find themselves under pressure to avoid certain topics, particularly those related to race, gender, sexuality, or politics. While the intention behind this is to foster a more inclusive society, the result is that many comedians are no longer willing, or able, to engage in the kind of risky, thought-provoking humor that once defined Australian comedy. This trend can be seen in the contrast between older and newer Australian comedies. Whereas shows like Full Frontal and the McAuliffe Program were unafraid to satirize the absurdities of politics and society, contemporary comedies often play it safe. They might pretend to be edgy or subversive, But the reality is that they tiptoe around controversial subjects, ensuring that they stay within the bounds of political correctness. This has led to a perception among many viewers that modern comedy is no longer funny in the way it once was. The biting wit, the clever satire, and the fearless punching up have been replaced with safe, inoffensive jokes that fail to provoke laughter, let alone critical thought. The role of power in comedy. What you can't laugh at controls you. One of the most telling signs of authoritarianism is the suppression of humor that targets those in power. As the saying goes, to find out who rules over you, find out who you're not allowed to criticize. Comedy, in its essence, challenges power by making the powerful appear ridiculous. Laughter diminishes authority, reduces fear, and empowers the oppressed. It is, therefore, no surprise that authoritarian regimes, both political and social, seek to suppress it. The film V for Vendetta provides a striking example of how humor can be used as a form of resistance. In one memorable scene, a television comedian performs a sketch that mocks both the vigilante V and the ruling political leader. The sketch is meant to satirize the state's oppressive rule, highlighting its absurdity and cruelty. However, the response is swift and brutal. The comedian is arrested, and the state crushes any further attempts at such mockery. The message is clear. Those in power cannot afford to be laughed at, because laughter threatens their authority. This scene parallels the current state of comedy in many parts of the world today. Certain topics are off-limits, and comedians who dare to make jokes about them face backlash, not from the state, but from societal forces that are deeply invested in maintaining certain power structures. Political correctness, in its most extreme form, serves as a tool for these forces, ensuring that certain ideas and individuals remain above criticism. This has a chilling effect on comedy, as comedians are forced to either avoid these topics or risk severe professional and personal consequences. The suppression of humor is not just about protecting certain groups from offense, it's about protecting power structures from scrutiny. When comedians are no longer allowed to make fun of political leaders, social movements, or controversial ideas, it's a sign that those entities have gained too much control over public discourse. Humor is one of the last remaining forms of dissent that can cut through propaganda and challenge the status quo, and when it is silenced, so too is the ability to resist authoritarianism. The power of laughter against fascism. Laughter is one of the most potent weapons against authoritarianism. It has the power to delegitimize authority, expose hypocrisy, and bring people together in solidarity against oppressive forces. Throughout history, comedians and satirists have played crucial roles in resisting fascism and other forms of authoritarian rule. By mocking the absurdity and cruelty of those in power, they help to demystify authority and give people the courage to challenge it. In the modern era, however, the rise of political correctness has placed new constraints on comedy's ability to perform this vital function. While political correctness originally emerged as a way to foster greater sensitivity and inclusivity, it has in many cases become a tool of suppression. Comedians who once used humor to challenge power are now forced to conform to a rigid set of norms, limiting their ability to speak truth to power. This is not to suggest that all forms of political correctness are inherently bad. There is certainly value in encouraging comedians to avoid punching down at marginalized groups. However, the current climate of extreme sensitivity has created an environment in which even mild forms of satire or mockery can result in severe social and professional consequences. As a result, many comedians choose to play it safe, avoiding controversial topics altogether, and producing content that is inoffensive but ultimately unfunny. The suppression of humor is particularly troubling in light of the role that comedy has historically played in resisting authoritarianism. Laughter has the power to unite people, to give them the courage to stand up to tyranny, and to expose the absurdities of oppressive systems. By limiting the scope of what comedians are allowed to joke about, political correctness is effectively silencing one of the most powerful tools we have for resisting authoritarianism. Conclusion: no balance between political correctness and comedy. In conclusion, there is an inherent tension between political correctness and comedy, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to strike a balance between the two. While political correctness aims to create a more inclusive and respectful society, it does so at the cost of free expression and the ability to challenge power through humor. Comedy, by its very nature, depends on the freedom to ridicule, question, and provoke, And when it is forced to operate within the confines of political correctness, it loses its edge. The decline of Australian comedy, once a beacon of irreverence and clever satire, is a prime example of this tension. Shows like Full Frontal and the McAuliffe program were unafraid to punch up at those in power, using humor to highlight the absurdities of society and politics. Today, however, Australian comedy has become increasingly politically correct, leading to safer, less provocative content that fails to capture the wit and sharpness of its predecessors. As we have seen in both history and fiction, the suppression of humor is a hallmark of authoritarianism. Those in power cannot afford to be laughed at, as laughter undermines their authority and exposes their vulnerabilities. Political correctness, in its extreme form, serves to protect certain power structures from criticism, silencing comedians who dare to challenge them. Ultimately, there is no balance to be struck between political correctness and comedy. The very nature of political correctness is to impose restrictions on what can and cannot be said, while the essence of comedy is to push boundaries and challenge norms. In a world where political correctness reigns supreme, comedy, and the freedom it represents, will always be the first casualty.